Over to you, Mark. It's very relevant content about critical control, so thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. It's wonderful to be here. This is certainly a topic that is very close to my heart. This is where we can, certainly as professionals, really have quite a strong impact in what we do in the lives of people. And I thought it was just before we get into the presentation, just to give you a bit of an idea of Sentis and who we are. So effectively, we are a safety management consulting firm. We support organisations to shift culture and leadership capability in high-risk organisations, particularly those with the potential for fatality. We operate in over 400, we've worked with over 400 organisations, 35 countries. We've delivered programs to over 180,000 people, lots of experience, and we have a strong foundation of research and have a dedicated team of organisational psychologists supporting the work that we do. So ultimately, our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. And our approach is really to drive personal responsibility and accountability for safety in the workplace, and by really assisting individuals to understand why safety should matter to them in the first place. And this is very relevant in terms of critical risk management, particularly where our systems can be quite often very human-centric, or a lot of the variability is related to the humans within the system, which we'll talk a little bit more to shortly. So as far as agenda, these are the main areas that we're going to talk to today. So critical control assurance, what it is, why it's important, how we can do it, the psychology of risk. So this is really to get a good understanding of the human component, and certainly the next step is to unpack the role of the leader as well in building the culture and the systems for effective critical control assurance. And then ultimately, we want to be able to leave you with some practical tips of how to move forward. We'll also have some time at the end where you can ask some questions, and time permitting, we'll be able to answer those for you. So I think as a good starting point, it's probably good to start with some terms of reference. So what we're really talking about here is, in terms of critical risk, is where there's a potential for a serious injury or fatality to occur. The critical risks are really the unwanted events that have the biggest potential to cause serious injury or fatality in our workplace, what we call a SIF event. I think there are different terminologies, but I just want to unpack that acronym as, and in the safety profession, we love these things, but the SIF is really a serious injury or fatality event. And in reality, these events are often rare, but the issue here is that because they're rare, sometimes they're not highly focused on, but the consequences when they do occur are always high to people and organisations. Hence why this is an important topic. So critical risk management in general is defined as a system or a systematic approach to, and it's integrated across multiple systems to ensure critical risks are known, they're in place, and they're effective. So for the purpose of eliminating, reducing potential for SIF events in our organisation, we need to have things called critical controls. And the definition of critical control is essentially anything that is considered crucial. So if you were to remove it, would increase the risk to an intolerable level. So it potentially results in, it could be seen as our last line of defense, but they're there really to either prevent or mitigate the potential for these significant events to occur. Some of the activities that you probably may be aware of, certainly with MIOSH and the framework that is in place are available to you. You can see that things like risk registers and bow ties and the like are often part of that planning stage, but it's continuous learning that we want to see through that process. But also our reporting systems often capture things like near hit data and instant data that should ultimately feed back as a system should. So essentially, this is our main focus for today. Is not only just the system itself, but understanding how the human relates to this, and what are the artifacts within the organisation that help us promote critical control assurance. So we thought, before we go through in detail the structure of critical control assurance, a foundational understanding of safety culture and the components of a safety culture are really, really essential for us to understand what we're looking at in terms of critical control assurance. The key elements of a safety culture, you can see here, are the practices. So quite often we have the procedures and the systems and tools in our environment to control the practices. We have environmental controls, and often these are the hard controls that we have out in the environment. So things like guarding and even PPE to a point. Then we have the person factor, and as I'm sure many of you know, and the person factor is often the piece that is most associated, if you will, to events occurring in our environment, or near hits and errors. And what's particularly important here is that, with 96% of people being associated with incidents in the workplace, we often focus on the practices and the environment quite heavily, and often the person component is under review. What we consider here is, and in the context of today's webinar, being around operational leadership in particular, we consider that leadership surrounds this model. It is effectively the glue that holds these components together through what we pay attention to, the systems and processes we use, and certainly our attitudes and how we communicate safety and culture, particularly what's important in the workplace and how work's done. So to break it down a little bit further, we thought it would be useful to look at how these particular elements of the safety culture look like in terms of critical risk management. The first one, these are a couple of areas that are common to critical risk management, is risk assessment tools. So it might be risk registers, bow ties and the like, might be permitting systems and safe work methods, and even performance standards and the like that define how work should be done. We also have incident classification systems that help us to identify where we should put our attention in terms of investigation practices and certainly actions and risk reduction actions. And we also have our safety management system in general, which is the combination of processes and procedures that come together to help us to perform safe work. But inherent within this, we often, if we're looking at incidents on their own, we quite often can't see the detailed themes or the underlying story that our data tells us. So having good data analysis process to detect sort of the hot spots that aren't detected when you're just looking at one individual event are particularly important. So that's sort of stepping back and looking deep. We also would have, and many companies do have, field interactions and verification processes. So these can be informal interactions with the workplace, where we're looking wide, but it can also be very, very focused, detailed or deep dives into particular critical controls. So that's just a number of practices out there. There are many more that we can include in here. In terms of the environment, the main areas there are around engineering and design to eliminate and mitigate risk. So quite often the hard controls, lockouts, those sorts of areas, guarding, what have you. PPE is also included in that area. We have the person. As we mentioned, this is quite often considered the variable because the people often design the practices and the environmental controls. And they're also required to put those controls in place and maintain them to a high standard. What's particularly important for us in terms of our control assurances is really the piece around the attitude of people and how they work towards implementing critical controls and ensuring that they remain effective. What we also find is that part of this attitude around critical risk and assurance is our willingness and the ability to actually verify critical controls. That's underpinned by some knowledge, but also the desire, the drive to go and check and verify. Willingness to stop work, certainly at the operational level, given the multiple pressures that can be in the environment, the ability to stop work, but also to put, controls in place or processes in place that allow us to actually start work with an underpinning of good control assurance. As we mentioned, what ties this all together is the leadership component. And so what we really want to bring into our focus today is that ability to identify potential events as they come through, and quite a large portion actually go undetected. We'll talk through that a little bit later. The confidence that we have to actually go and supervise high-risk work, to go and actually ask the right questions and to look deeply to verify those critical controls. Sometimes we might have frames around this where we say, oh, well, you know, that's the operation, that's the supervisor's job or the workers, but ultimately an understanding of the psychology of risk, it is important for us to get out there as well and provide feedback and look at how work is getting done. So willingness to share learnings is also an important part. So when we're actually going out and doing our observations and the like, we're looking for the workarounds that are occurring that perhaps don't match to our procedures or the way we expect things getting done, our work is imagined, if you will, and have an openness and a willingness to share our learnings, but also for the workers to share their learnings about how they experience critical control in implementation. So we would like to just take a quick poll. I'm going to hand over to Sarah, and what we're going to do is just ask you a question. You know, what portion, considering this human element, what portion of critical controls at your site or organisation would you consider difficult to implement? We'll leave that up for about 30 seconds. So the options there are 20%, 40, 60, or 80. So of the critical controls in your organisation that are available to people, what percentage would you consider are difficult to implement? Very interested in your feedback. So keep that up for a couple more seconds. And Sarah, when you're ready?
Yep, we are almost there. Thanks, Mark. Just a moment. It's like watching a race. All right, I think I'll share that now.
Great, thank you. All right, so very interesting. We've got 20%, I can see there. 20% have come up with difficult. And I appreciate here the term difficult can be somewhat subjective. So we'll talk through that shortly. 40% are saying we would consider those the controls difficult. 60%, we've got only 9% there saying that we cannot. So quite a close race between 20% and 40%. I propose we have a look at what the data is telling us. Okay. So 61%, when we did a very detailed analysis of over 168 serious incidents across multiple injuries or incidents, we found, and this is multiple industry sectors between 2020 and 21, we found that 61% of critical controls were, for the worker, difficult to implement. This means that they weren't fully enabled. It was difficult for the worker to apply this in the context of the work itself. So this is the reality of what's happening out there for people. We have the controls, but they can be difficult to actually implement and operationalize. So that's a really key point for us to consider here in terms of our verification. And when we're going and doing verifications, what is it that we're looking for? 49% of control failures involved intentional workarounds. And this is obviously related because what the worker is trying to do, or the work teams are trying to do, is get work done. And if the procedures or the processes and resources and tools that we provide are not available or difficult to implement, then workarounds are intentionally found. And if that continues over time, what we end up with is drift away from our procedures, away from the control assurance that we anticipate or imagine is in place. So our observation practices and the like can really hone in and find these workarounds. But the idea is that ultimately we're not out there to blame the worker. We certainly want to encourage an openness to this conversation, to understand what is it that we can do to help those controls become more effective and easier to implement. So we'll just introduce some brutal facts here. And this is work is done. High-risk work controls are not always fully effective or fully enabled. And this is really, bringing that person component that interacts with all the other elements we talked about in the safety culture. And that local operational risk tolerance is often driven by misaligned corporate systems. This is because they're difficult to implement. They're not congruent with work that's being done. So over 28% of workers or supervisors have adjusted their practices to suit the local circumstances or context that they experience. And 32% of control failures actually result from the routine work practices that drifted over time. Because of that misalignment and failure to detect, we get this drift. So we thought it would be useful to really overlay that incident data with safety culture and what we know about the importance of safety culture in critical control assurance. And some of you may be aware of a research paper that we've published called Driving a Positive Safety Culture. If you want to get hold of that, that's accessible. Just ask at the end if you like. But what we found in doing this very detailed analysis using our research team is that with over, using 562 focus groups, we had 5,000 people interviewed and 21,000 surveys completed. We found some really interesting facts about where the opportunities are for organisations to focus in on in terms of starting their critical control assurance journey. So one of them, with existing systems currently in place, the quality, as we said earlier, the quality of safety procedures was seen as the greatest opportunity to improve how work gets done to really address those issues that we just talked about. 51% related to management and safety commitment. This is often perceptions of the workforce, how they perceive the management's commitment, often identified through interaction in the workplace, the enabling processes they put in place, such as training, providing the right tools, contextualizing the work to existing circumstances, and how effective they generally seen in the interactions in field. The internal context is effectively what's occurring inside the organisation. So these might be competing targets or goals. They can be the level of change that's occurring in the workplace that's drawing people's attention or sometimes distracting them, and how well certain changes, and if you're implementing critical controls, and how well it's implemented in terms of change management. And at 40%, the willingness to report incidents and errors was considered to be one of the major opportunities. And I'm sure if many of you would be in the safety professional space, this one in particular is quite important, because if we're not getting data, or if there's no willingness to report that where near hits and the like are occurring in relation to SIF events, it makes it very difficult for us to make changes to the system. The fifth one there is around employee safety performance. And these are essentially the behaviours that the worker performs in implementing and operationalising safety or the practices that are provided from the system. And we thought it would be just worthwhile also in mentioning number 6, even though it's not in the top 5, but hazard awareness and control, this ability to detect the critical risks that are emerging through work, and then apply the appropriate controls was actually at 35%. So that was another one that's important in the context of where our greatest opportunities are to improve critical control assurance. So we thought it would just be useful to I guess, wrap this section up with a quote from James Reason, which says, if we can't change the human condition, we can change the conditions in which people work. So it's interesting, just to pause on. We cannot change the human condition. And what we're talking about here is that, the human condition itself is what it is, that we have limitations, biases, and a range of different influences on us, social and environmental and the like. So what we need to be able to focus on is the conditions in which people work. So if the conditions that we provide are misaligned with or don't include this in the design, then our systems won't have a high level of assurance. We also say that you can't change the conditions if you don't have a good understanding of the human condition itself. And so we're going to move into the psychology of risk now. Cool. Okay, so this is obviously the bread and butter of what we do here at Sentis. We're very, very much about enabling and empowering personal safety around and giving people tools and models, mental models to work with in terms of improving their own personal safety, and also in terms of leadership and how to achieve safe and productive cultures. So before we go into psychology of risk, it's worthwhile understanding what are these limitations. So we would start with cognitive limitations, and this effectively relates to things like, our brains just aren't well designed to detect things like slow changes. So that gradual drift that we're talking about is often undetected. So I think that's important for us as professionals, but in terms of operational teams, things like gradual changes like degradation of systems or even corrosion often goes through undetected because it's slow occurring. We can also be very selective, and I'm sure many of you can relate to that, where we focus on things that are important to us and filter out things that are not. So we can be very often when we're doing tasks, we can also be very task focused. So selective attention, obviously, is a big one there in terms of cognitive limitations. And some of you might be aware of some information that comes from neuroscience about the capacity in our attention for what they'd say plus or minus 2 on, we have 7 units of attention, plus or minus 2. And a good example of that is if someone was to rattle a shopping list off to you, you might remember approximately 7 things. But if these depend on a few other factors such as alertness and fatigue and what have you. So, what we're trying to say here is that people's attention is limited. So things that we want to prepare them with, and in terms of our planning, we need to keep that in mind as leaders. And certainly cognitive biases are prevalent as well. There's a litany of those. Skills and knowledge, the point being here is that if someone is new to the environment and hasn't experienced a particular task, they won't know perhaps what to expect. But on the converse of that, once we have become acclimatized to a particular environment, we're seeing the big heavy trucks or shunting of trains or high pressure or whatever it might be, we can become acclimatized to that. And as a result of that, we become habituated to our environment. So the question here is, do I know what risks I should be looking for in terms of skills and knowledge? So, and what do we do? What processes and systems do we have that are critical in ensuring skills and knowledge of our people in relation to critical controls. Alertness levels can obviously vary, so things like fatigue can creep in depending on the cognitive load of the task. So you can keep those sorts of things in mind. Levels of stress in the environment or at a personal level. Things like prescription drugs can obviously affect our ability to focus and make good decisions. And certainly when fatigue is in place, though, the capacity to put critical controls in place and certainly the willingness diminish. What we can do, and some areas that are particularly important around preparation, is we, as operational leaders, is ensuring that there's the right amount of time. So our demeanour around getting the task done, the way that we communicate, can lead to rushing. These are certainly the production pressures that we are competing against sometimes, and how people can tend to become habituated. And I've been doing this for years, so it's never happened before. Other things that are also competing for people's attention might be things like distraction in the workplace. And all of these are what we class as the limitations that relate to the human condition. So we're going to just offer a bit of a cheeky question here, which is, and this is to all of us. Do we have a good appreciation and respect for the risks involved? And I ask this, with an openness. Quite often, we hear back from some leaders, certain leaders, that they're not completely aware of the controls that are associated within the system itself. That could be a point of frustration. But for us, how would we depict that we have a good appreciation for the risks in our workplace, and what are the tools that we use for that? How would we demonstrate that? How do you demonstrate it? So just a pause point there. And the next one that also relates to this, so knowing and having capacity is one thing. The next bit is the attitude. Is do we have helpful attitudes towards risk assessment and risk management tools? And what I mean by that is quite often we can have a particular perspective on controls. The controls are written, they're in the system, they're there, people have got the documents. Is that enough? What do we actually want to be able to do in this space to help detect those workarounds, to detect where there's difficulty, what have you? And are our attitudes helpful in terms of risk assessments, making them not necessarily enjoyable? That can be quite challenging, but it's certainly collaborative and inclusive. So just some key points, and these are questions that you can potentially ask people in your workplace as well. Are we looking deeply enough? Do we have the right attitudes? So on this piece, the reason that attitudes are so important here, and this comes from the cognitive behavioural psychology, if you will. Generally speaking, we would say, well, look, it's kind of simple. The results that we get, things like our safety performance and the like, is a result of the behaviours that occur preceding it. And that's all well and good. Yeah, we can, and I think traditional methods are focused heavily on behaviour and trying to control behaviour and the like. But what we would like to propose is that foundational to behaviours is people's attitudes. Provide the framework for and the context for these behaviours, the choices that we actually make. And effectively, our attitudes, which is a combination of our thinking and feeling, are directly attributed to the results we get in life in general. This can also be applied, obviously, to safety. So the attitudes that we have in the environment, which is often associated with what we call climate, influence people's behaviours. So this can be at an individual level or a collective level, influence the behaviours that we get in the workplace, which then produce the results that we get. Quite often we only focus on those top two, but we would like to sort of encourage a deeper thinking in terms of what are the prevailing attitudes, the climate, if you will, for that are required to set up for critical control assurance at the level that we want. So breaking this down a little bit further, we thought we'd overlay this with some risk attitudes that we often see through things like surveys or cultural surveys and the like, in relation to critical control assurance, is this one. It'll be all right. It won't happen to me. So there's this sort of normalizing. I haven't seen it in my lifetime. Therefore the risk is not going to happen to me. So that obviously what sort of behaviours might then be associated with that sort of attitude. The other one is that sort of overconfidence piece, which is I know what's involved and nothing's gone wrong before. So that that sort of reliance a little bit on luck and previous experience. And the third one there is probably more related to operational leaders, and that willingness to actually get out in the field and go and verify, go and ask those questions, sometimes those difficult questions. I'm too busy to go policing my team. And quite honestly, that's probably the one that might be difficult for operational leaders to go out and do in context of other competing tasks that they might have on a day-to-day. So this really allocating the time to go out and have those interactions, and policing there provides a fairly negative frame, doesn't it? So, what sort of interactions do we actually want to have? So I'll just ask a question here. So we were talking quite a lot about workarounds in the past, and I just want to ask the question here, are workarounds always a bad thing? So we mentioned that over 61% of people found procedures difficult to implement. And as a result of the desire to get things done, to get work done and for work to flow, human ingenuity comes about, we adapt. But are they always a bad thing? And how does this relate to the fidelity of our critical control systems? So just I thought it would be useful to tell you a story. I'm sure you've all heard about man's landing on the moon. And one thing that hasn't really been well published until fairly recently with Buzz Aldrin is the story of once they had actually landed on the moon, it's how do we get off? So there's normally a sequence that have to go through, charge up the lunar module, get off the surface of the moon, and get back to the Challenger. So this was the Apollo 11 mission, and they basically landed on the moon. And it was last day. They were about to go and have their first sleep before they go back up. And Buzz was about to pull up, and he noticed a bit of black plastic floating around in the environment, inside the module. So, that's interesting. That shouldn't be happening. So he plucked it out of the air and had a look at it, and looked like a switch. And he's, oh, that's interesting. So he'd gone over to the circuit breaker and found that it was the circuit breaker switch that had probably been knocked by maybe one of their suits or something like that, that was related to the ENG arm, which is arm engine switch, which was required to activate the rockets to get off the moon. So he thought, well, that's pretty significant. Better call Houston, and called Houston up and said, look, we've got this piece of plastic. We're not going to be able to arm the inners. What should we do? Houston said, don't worry, have a sleep, and in the morning we'll have it sorted out for you. Obviously, Buzz was probably a little bit disturbed by this situation, and woke up a couple of hours earlier and said, Houston, how are you going? And they said, we haven't got a solution for you. So what we've got here is now a situation where there's 8 hours left of oxygen, and the need to get the lunar module off the moon. So Buzz thinks about, well, how can I get the circuit breaker to push it back in and into a position where it's going to allow the rockets to fire up. He thought about it, and obviously electrical circuit. He's thought about a ballpoint pen. Said, no, that's not going to work. He then found another pen, a felt tip pen, and he's used that to push into the gap and activate or open up the circuit breaker, which allowed them to actually fire up the rockets. So effectively, this is a clear example of a workaround. And in this situation, it saved the day. So if you think about pure risk management systems, of course, NASA would have had great risk management practices around expected or anticipated risks, but they didn't have one for this. And effectively, a circuit breaker is a control in itself. So in this situation, the workaround was required and actually saved the day. So just I think it's worthwhile thinking about this. So we often come through in our risk practices with a very, right, we've captured everything, but quite often we need to be able to adjust and adapt. And what practice can we put in place to make it happen? So given that, that's the pen that was actually used. And you can see there that the dent in the middle of the pen was actually as a result of it being jammed into the circuit breaker. And yeah, as mentioned, that's now in the museum in Houston. So I think it'd be good to just sort of close that section off with a quote, which comes from the ICMM, which is behavioural and procedural controls are here to stay. Therefore, there is a need to make sure that their inherent frailty is understood. This includes an increased understanding of the social, psychological, organisational culture, and culture change, as well as an appreciation of human error and reliance. And one thing I'd like to posit here is that contemporary thinking says that human error is a consequence of the design of our systems, as opposed to the cause of our events, if you will. Okay, so saying that, with all these psychological, social, cultural factors there that we need to consider when we're designing effective critical control assurance, there's one key area that we would posit is, and according to our statistics as well that we showed earlier, it is the role of the human, of the leader that probably has the greatest impact on behaviours, those operational level or local level behaviours. So with that, we might just take a quick poll and ask you, which of the local factors do you believe most contributes to events occurring? And I'll give that 30 seconds also. Really interested to see what your thoughts are here. So we've got excessive risk tolerance. So that's the sort of the collective tolerance at the operational level. You've got inadequate supervision, which is very much related to the operational leader. Tolerance of poor systems, so that's those misaligned systems that we were talking about. And then, of course, equipment failure. So if we give you a few seconds, sorry, just to just put your vote in there on which one do you think of these local factors most contributes to events occurring?
Mark, yeah, so just waiting a couple of seconds more, not long.
No worries, thank you.
Started off with a clear winner and now it's become a race again. So,
great, wonderful.
Now, and there we go.
Awesome, thank you very much, Sarah. So what we have is a fairly close tie between tolerance of poor systems and excessive risk tolerance. So that's really talking a lot to some of those areas we're talking about. Our systems aren't well designed around that poor systems piece. That it makes it difficult for people to do what they do and to achieve the control of standards. We also have excessive risk tolerance. Wonderful. And inadequate supervision is coming in at 24%, and no one has picked equipment failure, which certainly is a testament to the journey that we've had over the last 100 years, if you will, where equipment performance has certainly improved. Great. Thank you, Sarah. I propose we have a look at some of the data. So, hence the importance of this webinar, if you will, is it really highlights that inadequate supervision has, in terms of the influence it has on critical control effectiveness, is certainly the top, very close to excessive tolerance. That was similar to what people were saying in the poll. So these two, account for the greater proportion of the local factors that are contributing to control effectiveness. Tolerance of poor systems was third, and you can see equipment maintenance of failure was quite low down in the hierarchy. There's a few others there, which is procedures being outdated, complacency, excessive self-confidence also feature, but the ones we really want to bring attention to is the inadequate supervision and the effect it has on in the workplace. So what we found is that through a meta-analysis in 2021 on 168 incidents, showed that upstream causal factors were still significant. So we're talking here mainly about local level, which is the operational context. But that's organisational factors were significant. We don't have the time today really to go into some of those organisational factors, but we thought it was worth noting that the factors at the local level were predominantly related to outdated procedures, complacency, lack of follow-up, provision of inadequate equipment. They were the dominant factors. And the inconsistency of leadership also came up, which was supervision capacity and competence. So it's the capacity of the supervisors to actually be able to monitor and adequately supervise the scope of work that they have and the number of work groups that they have and the like, and the complexity of the work as well. So it's the capacity issues as well as the competence that's featuring here. So the influence of the leader really comes down to some key points here. We've seen that the influence of the leader can have a major effect on implementation. But they also, in terms of attitudes, they set the tone and help shape the environment in which high-risk works are completed. And particularly in a social setting, they act as role models. So they effectively define what's expected of the wider team, and they influence attitudes and behaviours of others through their words and actions. So our operational leaders have the most direct influence in terms of attitudes and the climate that we have at the work, the local level. So this is particularly important. The quality of leadership, therefore, is very much related to the leader's own tolerance to risk. So think about the types of leaders we have, what their preferences are, their biases, what have you, as they are such a key component of critical control effectiveness. So given that, what we want to provide the audience is really an understanding of a good framework for effective safety leadership. And this framework has been, from Sentis, has been based on quite a lot of research to do with transactional and transformational leadership, which are two components. Transactional being heavily associated with items such as compliance, which are very important in terms of critical control assurance and making sure that the rigor is applied to the system being implemented. But also the transformational piece really encourages people to bring some discretionary effort, even when things are difficult, to raise issues, to have the psychological safety to bring suggestions, to report potential errors. So what we found is that both transactional and transformational leadership styles are particularly relevant depending on what area of critical control assurance we're looking at. So unfortunately, there's quite a lot of models out there that are not based on sound theoretical foundations, but we'll run through this particular model to give you an understanding of how this might overlay in terms of critical control assurance, what we're looking for. So the first point here, which is around supporting team members, is making sure that our team members receive the right training in critical risks. They understand how to identify what the why is behind putting the controls in place, how to actually put the controls in place and ensure that they're effectively implemented and monitor those. and that we have active supervision of high-risk work, and there is a process in place to verify the effectiveness of critical controls. There's a number of these. Some of them are obviously pre-task. There's a few during and following tasks as well. So support is considered a fairly transactional piece. Recognising is also considered a transactional leadership capacity, where we actually go out and reward and recognise team members, based on the demonstration of the behaviours that are correlated with effective safety and critical control assurance. So we particularly when we're performing high risk activities or choosing to stop work, the ability for a leader to demonstrate the intelligence of including the social intelligence, to raise when people are actually doing the right thing as opposed to the absence of safety, is a particular skill here that we would certainly encourage. Active care is essentially the care that a team member shows to other individuals, and that can be around the transformational piece, where there is a genuine interest and focus on the individual and how they perform. And this might be how they turn up for work on a given day, whether they're affected by any of those limitations that we talked about earlier, and how they're generally going. Collaboration or sharing ownership of safety with team members is inspiring others to participate, which is a transformational aspect. And through that participation, what we're doing is mobilizing discretionary effort. So it empowers people to take personal responsibility, to go that extra yard, which, when things are difficult, to really enable those true controls, and it helps them to understand their role as well in safe, productive work. We highly recommend that our leaders, safety leadership competency is really, what is your vision? Or can you articulate the vision in a way that's meaningful for the people that you're talking to? So if we're doing interactions in the field, how do we connect and recognize those behaviors that people are showing, but connect it to the vision, and that helps to mobilize, again, a discretionary sense of belonging in relation to how their actions relate to the overall culture. How inspiring people, this is not, and I want to make a point about this, this is not charismatic leadership. It's not necessary in terms of inspiring people, but having a genuineness and the ability to utilize vision and connect it with what people are doing certainly is. It's a very powerful motivator, and is a great way to communicate and have the message received. So being able to articulate the vision in particular, and when things are going well. Role modeling is, as we mentioned before, from a social psychology perspective, people are, very, very much relate to, or sometimes align their behaviours and their attitudes to their one-up, or certainly the leadership within the operational space. So role modeling is particularly important, and that's not just making sure we do what we say we're going to do, but it's really having that interest, looking at where the workarounds are, having that openness to collaborate and share learnings. All of those elements help role model the type of culture that is conducive to critical control assurance. And the last one there is around challenge. And here, I just want to caution myself before rather than thinking about this as confronting, this is about openly asking questions. And we love questions at Sentis, that's really how we get people thinking. Asking the right questions that challenge not only the knowledge and understanding of critical control assurance at the workforce level, but also how might things get improved? How might we be able to adapt to the workarounds and make sure that our systems actually are enhanced as a result of those learnings? So there's a series of, there's 8 key competencies there that we would like to share with you that certainly relate to critical control assurance. Just on that, there as far as our programs go, there are a number of assessment tools that can actually be used, adopted to help individuals measure that for themselves and therefore to focus on where the development areas for them are. So some leadership touch points that we would like to, these are on the practical side of things, some areas that we can have the most influence. Firstly is work scheduling. So before it even gets to the actual execution phase, making sure that we're integrating our critical control assurance, our controls, whether it's putting work packs together with the permits and the right procedures, and planning for the right equipment and tooling to be there, and the right people to be present, and even the ensuring that we have the right supervision in place to execute the work. Once it does actually transition over to the task being performed, or the day of the work, pre-starts are probably one of the most impactful areas that operational leaders can really get the message across, the cadence that they want work to be performed at. The things that are important, so whether certain critical risks are involved in the tasks and what's expected. At the pre-start, that can really be one of the most strongest points to get that message across and really turn people on and switch their brains on. Obviously, things like inductions and training are key here as well. Safety meetings, so again, getting the message and ensuring that there's participation from the workforce in these meetings as well. So us turning up as operational leaders is particularly important, but also that we're encouraging participation, so that two-way dialogue to occur. We assume that many of you would have both formal and informal field interactions, so they might be under a structured approach, such as observations, safety observations, or they might be specific to critical controls, such as control verifications, where there's a bit of a checklist to go through to ensure that the full extent of the control is verified in field. Things like safety communications, though, the cadence of putting these out as well, just to keep these things front of mind. So things like alerts, so that there is meaning that's coming out of events that occur in the workplace, or near hits. The bulletins, notifications, and posters, again, just can be useful as environmental cues to help prime people around keeping it front of mind, particularly as we mentioned before, the risk can be normalised over time. Feedback loops, again, very important. So if we want good data to come in, probably the one area where we see quite a lot of opportunity in general is to get that message back to people of, hazard reporting is important, or near hit reporting is important. And they see that through the action of giving feedback and closing that loop out and knowing that something's done or not done if it's not deemed to be reasonable or practicable, but that closeout loop being essential. And we've already talked to reward and recognition and as a process of continually validating the behaviours that people choose and people's attitudes in relation to control assurance. Other areas that we would also talk about in terms of their importance is event notifications. So hazard reporting is one piece. What we find is that near hits, the severity potential in those is quite often underrated, if you will. So because there's no actual event occurs, if it's just a potential event, sometimes the investment to go and investigate and put resources in to actually understand why and get those learnings are often sometimes at odds with the more injury-related, where there was no further potential, but it might relate to things like TRIFA or what have you. They're still important, but what we find is that they're probably not well balanced with the likes of near hits around SIF potential. So making sure that we include those messages in our things like pre-starts and toolboxes and posters. So just to close out on the ABR model, this is the attitudes really that leaders have a direct influence on the behaviours that others have and our teams have. That attitude to productivity and risk tolerance are probably the key areas that we're that are most important for leaders to become aware of. Particularly if they're biased and they're not aware of their own biases sometimes. So really understanding that perceived pressure has an influence on other people's behaviour and can lead to optimising behaviours. And that failure to adequately deal with emerging issues and changes, I'm sure many of you know and have seen just the impact of one change in the environment or the context and how that is often associated with an event sequence. So the ability to deal and adapt with things and changes before the workaround occurs or before an emerging risk is realised. If the attitudes that underpin our actions are unhelpful to the workforce, it's going to have an impact on the goal of achieving safe work ultimately. So where we can help our supervisors and frontline is to become aware of those unhelpful thinking and unhelpful feelings that they might have around things like risk assessments and reporting in particular. So we would just like to close on some practical tips for operational leaders. And there's, it's rare that we would use, those safety leadership competencies in isolation. So they're often combined in terms of operationalising them in practice. So a couple of key points here is firstly to understand your risk profile. So we really want our operational leaders to understand the risk profile that applies to the work that they're overseeing and to know their critical controls. It's not just to know the critical controls, but be able to know when they're effective. So the way we can do that is obviously understanding the system and having a good framework for understanding critical risk management. And there's many examples of that, which if you need assistance with, you can reach out to the likes of NIOSH and Sentis. There are, obviously, in addition to that, is really the focus, as we mentioned, the attitudes that we need to be able to take the time to implement these controls. So once we've designed the system, we've got that in place. It's making sure that we enable our people and our leaders to implement those controls. Many of you probably heard stop work authorities, which are very important, of course, that people feel empowered to stop the work and when a control is not effectively implemented. We like to just offer an alternative to that, which is a start work authority, and that safety effectively is seen as a precondition to getting work done. What an example of that might be, if you're writing a JSA, if I was a supervisor, for example, and I've got multiple work teams and I want to go and verify a particular control in place before work starts or at a certain stage in the task, I might put a hold point into the JSA and say, look, before you start here, let me know. I need to come and verify. So there's a number of ways to ensure and adapt to emerging risks and to have good control assurance. The other one there is to incorporate feedback, learning, and refocus through pre-starts and other mechanisms. So by pre-start, sometimes mid-task, we might do a restart. If there's been good reporting coming up and said, look, we found this, we might then effectively restart the process again. In terms of continuous improvements, this is always front and center to critical control assurance, and particularly making sure that we detect the drift that may come about because of difficult practices or slow changes, we really want to encourage this idea, and this comes from Silicon Valley, where they're in the process of actually developing new software. They said, well, we don't want to get to the end of the process and then realize that there's a problem. We want those ideas or those issues to be raised early. We want that to happen often. And it's going to be ugly because it's not always nice to say, well, this is not in place, or we've had a near hit, or whatever it might be. It's going to be ugly, but that's okay. So I think that's a really helpful frame for us to think about, the type of reporting culture that we envisage, that we want, and then encourage people to live that themselves. Part of that would therefore involve celebrating the good catches. So quite often we look for the absence of things, absence of control effectiveness, or the absence of damage or injury. What we want to be able to do is identify more the good stuff when it comes through. So a reporter works that a control is not effective, and ideally suggests something that would be great. That's the stuff that we can, as leaders, be really rewarding and recognising as it comes through. So being proactive, so learning the weak signals. Highly recommend here is really understanding where we might get variability in our work. So between work as we've planned sometimes, and then work as it's actually done. Identifying those weak signals. So where might things be ineffective, and exploring workarounds in a curious way, in terms of understanding. Well, people don't often do things to get hurt. They're not trying to violate things. The workarounds are often occurring because of the design of our systems. So really understanding that provides such great value for us to improve how we do control assurance. And then obviously taking action and addressing those gaps. We also highly recommend things like, particularly if you're doing control assurance and to encourage that openness, is using field verification processes that are de-identified. So people can report, they feel safe to do that. They're voluntary, therefore, and anonymous, so that people are willing to share their lived experiences with you. And the last one there is we often need a framework up front to control or to put our controls in place. But quite often, in order for us to detect the weak signals in our data, so when we're often looking at one event on its own, we don't see the full story, to actually do some rigorous data analysis, looking at not just the events, the actuals, but quite often the classification of near hits, because it sometimes is convenient to not have to drill down too far in terms of investigation on those because nothing happened, and just looking at the fidelity of that system, what it's telling us, and then again to feed that back in to our control assurance processes, and ideally make it simpler, but not just simple, but simpler perhaps, for people to implement controls in the workplace. So if you would like any further information about the safety climate surveys, or how you might implement a critical control assurance culture or processes, please feel free to reach out if you'd like to. I'll just offer, that's great, thank you, Sarah. If you'd like to have more information from Sentis, please click on yes, and we'll be happy to share with you any of our insights that help you to move this very important topic forward. Great.
Okay, we're up to questions now, Mark.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, I don't have any questions just yet, but we're just going to wait a couple of seconds because they normally do come in. We did have a comment earlier, something to do with moon landing, but that's been removed. And
always get some interest, that one. Yeah, interesting story.
Yes, okay. I have shared a link in the chat because next week is a Sentis webinar as well. So that's going on the state of safety culture in mining, and it's an exclusive access to Sentis's latest industry report presented by Anthony Gibbs and Dr. Amy Hawkes. Question from Chris, do you do any work within the retail space?
Wonderful, thanks, Chris. Yeah, look, we work across multiple industries, of course, retail being one of them. If you'd like to reach out to us, we'd be more than happy to share some of those insights that occur in your specific industry.
Okay, and I had another question from Jake. What advice would you give to organisations who want to implement a positive critical control assurance culture?
That's a great question, and quite a broad question as well. The foundation, I would say, for establishing a critical control culture, firstly, is to consider those three areas that we talked about in terms of the structure of a culture. So that I would start with the practices and having a good framework for critical control assurance and how you go about identifying what your key risks are, putting the controls, the standards, if you will, in place. And so following the analysis really sets the foundation for the culture. So knowing what it is that we're actually going to do, how we'll evaluate it, how we'll verify that it's effective, are a couple of key areas that we would include in that. Once that's in place, we would highly recommend doing, understanding good data. So there's a couple of other areas, understanding your safety culture. There are a range of diagnostics that are available for that, and then putting in targeted interventions, so targeted change interventions is one key area. Training people, of course, certainly in the enablers that we would say with regards to the psychology and the leadership component. And probably the last one is ensuring the system actually feeds back in itself, is good data analysis, post, from the reporting of things like near hits and the like, and control effectiveness verifications and what have you. Hope that helps.
Okay, Christian, about a copy of the presentation. Yes, we send it out either later today or tomorrow. The event page will have a YouTube video on and a podcast and the slides, so you can share that with others too. And Robert says, do you have any thoughts on the removal of a dedicated HS manager role with the intent of empowering all to be safety conscious?
That's a very interesting question, and I'll be cautious to not be inflammatory here. I think that safety professionals have an absolute, and I have a bias, so I'll sort of talk to that. Safety professionals have an absolute place in, certainly in the techniques that we use to analyse critical risks. They are subject matter experts. Ultimately, we want to be able to have people that are unbiased, to things like productivity or other operational demands. So I would say to you, it's a great question. I would say ownership of the controls once in place should really sit with the operations ultimately. But they need to be empowered and enabled to do that. So I'd say that they both really have a place, and I think that, so it's a wonderful question. I hope I've answered your question there, but I think both are essential.
So Noel says, any tips on managing safety with subcontractors?
Well, yes, 100%. Like it would be very, so understanding the complexities, I think that being a contractor in an operational setting, I would probably suggest, Noel, that there are more complexities associated with contractors, and this is also demonstrated through the high proportion of quite often incidents that are related to SIF with contractors. There can be multiple systems which have an impact on the cognitive load of people, what they can actually retain and apply. They might often be operating under different systems if they're going to different sites, which can put a level of pressure on the fidelity. Well, whose controls are we actually putting in place? So the operator and the contractor can have, the owner, I should say, can both have a place in that. But I think understanding that quite often with culture, you have to be able to invest deeply in people. And if you have a transient workforce, or if you have a highly mobile workforce, that investment can often require a bit more rigor to ensure that people know the controls that are in place, that they're adequately verified, supported, and included in the design of work. So I think that that is probably a few areas that I'd highly suggest. But if you would like more information, please reach out.
Okay. I'm fairly conscious of time, and there were quite a few questions, so we'll just do one more. From Noel, what can Mark share his thoughts on the quality and effectiveness of SWIMs in the workforce?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because we often rely heavily on it. It's like almost like the last line of defense to be able to articulate what's coming through things like risk registers and bow ties that say these are the controls and here are the performance standards or expectations, and translating that into then the swim of how we're actually going to do work, I think is an amazing conversation to be able to have. A few areas that I would really recommend to improve quality and effectiveness is making sure that the supervisors are involved upstream in the planning of work, so they understand what's cascading down in terms of those critical risks, making sure that we have good, in the planning stage, making sure we're pulling together the resources that they need. So that might be in the form of a work pack with all the controls that you know, maybe even a section of the risk register that relates to the work that's being performed. It might be include the permit that's there, but also the upstream responsibilities around organising equipment and tools. You know, that they also understand their responsibility. So it goes all the way up the hierarchy. But I think ultimately, in terms of, you know, one key area that I would just like to share that I've seen quite useful when supervisors are quite spread across and they're using a swim, to be able to ensure that the controls are well verified or in place and verified, is to sometimes put a space in the swim to say, at this point, we're just going to stop. We're just going to recheck, because quite often, you know, we do a swim and then we're off. Yeah, it's just to have pause points sometimes in the swim to be able to allow people to collect their thoughts, to check their environment, and to refocus effectively. Sometimes, as mentioned, we can become quite task focused. So I think the risk with swims is that they can just become a tick and flick, as I'm sure many of you would agree. And how do we keep those things alive, particularly when changes occur?
Okay. Well, thank you, Mark. I think if anyone has any other questions, your contact details are on the email that we send out later today, so they can send them through. And there's a link to the webinar next week. That's great. Thanks for joining us today, Mark. Once again, Sentis is providing some great information for everyone.
Our pleasure, Sarah. And thank you to everyone that's joined. And I hope that's been of value to you. All the best.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. See you next week.